Hi everyone, welcome to week 5, video 1. This week's topic is on inexpressibility, or the general idea that there are things which can't be said in language, and specifically we're going to look at Wittgenstein's arguments for the conclusion that there are things that can't be said in language. We're going to try and examine what sorts of things those might be, how he came to that conclusion, and what the ramifications of that conclusion are for Wittgenstein's view of philosophy, metaphysics, etc. So, inexpressibility is not a new notion with Wittgenstein. There have been in the history of philosophy people who've thought there are things which somehow human language is not equipped to describe, or that the human mind is not equipped to conceptualize. Kant famously had a distinction between things as they appear to us, which we can conceptualize, discuss, use language to describe, and things in themselves, about which Kant thought we could have no knowledge whatsoever. Russell, we saw in week 1, thought that there were some things which one can't say. For instance, one can't assert that a property of a certain logical type is applicable to a property of type higher than itself. This was the way that Russell sought to circumvent his own paradox by instituting a so-called type theory, which basically imposes limits on what it's sensible to say so that you don't get paradoxes. So inexpressibility is not completely novel. I think it's fair to say that Wittgenstein's treatment of the subject of inexpressibility is novel, and that he's potentially one of the most notorious philosophers for claiming that there are things which cannot be said or expressed in language. So, where does Wittgenstein say that there are things which can't be expressed in language? In several places in the Tractatus, but this week I think what we want to do is look at remark 4.12 specifically, where Wittgenstein says that propositions can represent the whole of reality, but they can't represent logical forms. So what does this mean? I think first we need to look in more detail at this notion of a logical form. We've already come across it in earlier weeks. Wittgenstein says that a proposition, in order to be able to represent something, in order for it to be able to represent the state of affairs that it does represent, must have something in common with the state of affairs that it represents. If the thing representing the picture or the proposition was totally different, had nothing in common with what it represents, Wittgenstein thinks that we would be at a loss to say how it is that it represents that thing at all. So he says there's got to be something that these two items, representing item and represented item, have got in common. Wittgenstein says this thing is the logical form. It's quite a sort of slippery notion, this one of logical form in the Tractatus, so I think we'll do well to get a bit clearer on what Wittgenstein exactly means here. Wittgenstein says earlier, before 4.12, he says, and this is his definition of form, he says, form is the possibility of structure. And he says that the structure of a thing, is the way in which its components are combined with one another. So, a logical form, we might say, is a possibility of a structure. This is still very abstract. What does it really mean for propositions? Well, a proposition has a form in common with what it represents. A logical form. A logical form is the possibility of a way in which some elements are combined. So a proposition represents a state of affairs, and if the state of affairs exists, then the proposition in question is true. What does it mean for the state of affairs to exist? Well, it means that the constituent objects for which the names of the proposition stand be related to one another in the way the proposition represents them as being related. So a proposition might represent a cat being on a mat. It represents the state of affairs of a cat being on a mat because the constituent elements of the proposition or the picture stand for the objects, the cat, the mat, and the relation of being on top of. Obviously, we've already said last week that these sorts of items won't count as genuine objects, but for the Tractatus, but let's just assume that they are for now. So a proposition represents a state of affairs. It represents some object as being combined in a certain way. And if the objects which it represents as being combined in a certain way are combined in that way, if they do inhabit a structure, then the state of affairs that's represented exists. It's thereby a fact, and the proposition in question is true. Well, form is the possibility of structure. And a proposition represents the objects as being related to one another in the same way that the names of the proposition are related to one another. That's how a proposition represents a state of affairs. It represents some object as related to one another in virtue of its constituent names being related to one another in a certain way. So what the proposition and the state of affairs have in common is that in both the proposition and the state of affairs, the elements of the proposition are capable of being related in a certain way. They have the possibility of structure, and indeed in the proposition they do exhibit a structure. And in the state of affairs, the objects which, if they were combined, would make the state of affairs exist, those objects have the possibility of combining in that way. So in both the proposition, let's just repeat this because it's tricky. In the proposition, the names are capable of combining with one another in a certain way. That's what it means to say that there's a possibility of structure there, a possibility of structure built into the characteristics of the names. And in the state of affairs that's being represented, the objects are capable of being combined with one another in a certain way. So logical form is possibility of structure, and what the proposition and what it represents have got in common is that in both cases, the constituents, in the former case the names, in the latter case the objects, are capable of combining into a structure, capable of combining in the same way. That's what Wittgenstein means when he says that a proposition and the thing that the proposition represents have a logical form in common. He means that the elements of each item possess the same combinatorial potential. They possess the same possibility of being related to one another in a structure. Now, in the case of the proposition, the names will be in the structure. They will be related to one another. That's how the proposition makes sense. In the state of affairs, the objects need not actually be related to one another, because of course the proposition could be false, in which case the objects wouldn't be related to one another as the proposition represents them as being. So this is what Wittgenstein really means by logical form. He means a shared capacity for the elements of the proposition and the thing represented to combine in parallel structures. So why does Wittgenstein say that the logical form of a proposition cannot itself be represented? Well, I think the idea is something like this. We've just said that if you really investigate what the word logical form means, or the phrase, it's two words, the phrase logical form means, what you'll see, according to Wittgenstein, is that the logical form of a proposition really is wholly reducible to the kind of joint characteristics of the constituent names of the proposition. So if we're investigating the logical form of a certain proposition, what we really have to do is look at the names and look at what they're capable of combining into. Look at the ways in which those names are capable of combining with one another. The form is a possibility, and it's a possibility which supervenes on or reduces to, well, totally reduces to, the combinatorial characteristics of the constituent names of the proposition. Likewise for the state of affairs. The logical form of a state of affairs wholly reduces to the combinatorial potential of the objects. All there is to a logical form of a thing is a sort of joint collective combinatorial potential of some constituents. So what does this mean for Wittgenstein's remark at 4.12 that we can't represent logical forms? Well, what it means is that in Wittgenstein's view, the phrase logical form is a noun phrase in ordinary language. When we look at a proposition, we say, what is the proposition's logical form? We have a noun phrase there, and that misleads us into thinking that there's such a thing, an individual unit or entity or object, which is called a logical form. Just because the phrase we use is of such a kind that other phrases of the same kind, other noun phrases similarly indicate that there's a thing which the phrase stands for, like the word Ollie is a noun, and we think, well, what's the meaning of that word? Well, it's me. I'm what you mean when you say the word Ollie. We likewise think, what do we mean when we use the word logical form? And Wittgenstein thinks we're misled into thinking that when we use that phrase, we mean an object, a single thing. But what he wants to emphasise, and what he thinks he has emphasised prior to 4.12, is that there isn't really a thing, a single object called a logical form. The logical form of a proposition is distributed amongst the characteristics, the combinatorial potentialities possessed by the constituent names. The logical form of a proposition isn't itself an object. It's a possibility of structure built into the possibilities of combination possessed by the constituents. Constituent names in the case of a proposition, constituent objects in the case of a state of affairs. So Wittgenstein thinks that there is no such thing, single object, called the logical form. Logical form reduces and is distributed amongst the constituents of the item possessing the logical form, and consequently there's no such thing as a logical form which can be named. It's a misleading feature of grammar that that implies that there is such a thing as logical form. There are no such things as logical forms. There are only objects or names. So Wittgenstein thinks that when you really understand how the phrase logical form can be analysed and how its meaning can really be correctly understood, you'll realise that there is no such thing as the logical form of a proposition. Therefore, there's no such object as a logical form which can be named. And if there's no such object as a logical form which is capable of being named, then there's no such thing as a logical form that can be represented as being a certain way. At 4.12, Wittgenstein says that propositions can't represent logical forms. They can't represent logical forms because there's no such things as logical forms. The idea that there are is an error which we are led into by the fact that it happens to be a noun phrase, logical form. If you really understand how that phrase gathers its meaning, you'll see that there's no such thing. There aren't, in Wittgenstein's ontology, objects and then special objects called logical forms. There just aren't such things. So, of course, we can't represent them as being a certain way because there's no such thing. That's Wittgenstein's point, I think. So we can't represent logical forms. There's no such thing. And even to say, strictly speaking, even to say, I can't represent that logical form is nonsense. Because the phrase, that logical form, in the sentence I've just uttered, doesn't refer to anything. So it's not just false to say that we can't represent logical forms, it's nonsensical to say that we can't represent logical forms. That's Wittgenstein's idea in 4.12. We cannot represent logical forms because if you really understand how that phrase comes to be meaningful, you'll see that it's highly misleading and it implies a kind of metaphysical view of logical forms which is incorrect. So that's the idea. We can't represent possibilities. I mean, another way of thinking about it is like this. The logical form of something is a possibility of structure. Well, a possibility isn't an actual thing, because then it would be an actuality. We can't represent possibilities because there's no such thing as a possibility. So looking for logical forms in the world to go and represent them as being a certain way is a sort of fool's errand, Wittgenstein thinks. It's a misconstrual of what logical form really is. Logical forms are distributive, built into the combinatorial potentialities of the elements composing the thing, the proposition, or the state of affairs. They're not objects themselves, so they can't be named. There's nothing to name. I think that's enough for this video. That's a sort of brief sketch of the argument Wittgenstein is aiming at, although he doesn't give that argument, he just asserts the conclusion, in remark 4.12. In the next video, we'll look at what the ramifications are for that conclusion. Okay, thanks guys.